Namaste. After a gap of 2 weeks, here we are back to continue evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste. Happy to be with all of you.
In the continuation of the theme, the types of learners, today we will explore the distinctions between the masculine and the feminine. As usual, you may post your questions in the chat box, or you may send beforehand your questions at our email ID, integralstudies.in@gmail.com.
As part of our larger discussion on education, we looked at various types of learners, types of human beings, psychological types, and so on, from the educational point of view. And today we will dwell on one particular distinction which is extremely important. In some ways it will be provocative because there is a tendency in the modern mind, or let's say the modern fashionable trend, to blur out distinctions between men and women and to make it seem as if there is none and all these are merely constructs coming from social imposition, controls, and so on. But in fact, according to our own understanding from scientific observations, there are fundamental biological distinctions even in the brain of the male and the female, not just in human beings but in all animals. There are other hormonal workings which are so different, and some of them are so different that if you were to swap one for the other, the species would not survive, the individual would not survive. Obviously, these have massive psychological ramifications, and particularly from a learning point of view, which will be our, let's say, eventual objective. But to be able to understand that really well, we need to go deeper and understand the origin of this distinction, the basis for it, and then we will be able to better appreciate not only the biological distinctions, psychological distinctions, but also to what extent those distinctions are binding, to what extent they represent a starting point for something greater, and so on. So, last time we had discussed the 4 soul powers and the 3 modes of nature, and how these 4 into 3 combine to make 12 variations, and upon these, of course, you can have innumerable other variations. But these two, the masculine and the feminine, are as if somehow independent of these. They as if represent something more fundamental at the very origin of creation. So I'll discuss this in 3 stages. First, the purely spiritual foundations. Second stage will be their reflection in the psychological workings, and not specific to human beings but purely as psychological powers, qualities. And the third will be what happens when these are embedded in the biology. And so what we will first discuss now is completely independent of biology, has nothing to do with gender. Though we will use the terms masculine and feminine, please, in your mind at least, free yourself from any association with the male and female. And we only call it masculine and feminine. We could have called it something totally different, and we will also in passing. But we only call it that because we project from below upwards. And as if the male-female characteristics we try to abstract to their essential psychological, and that we project to something which is of a deeper principle. So the separation from the biology and the psychological principle is very important at the initial stage, and then later we will see how that plugs into the biology. The initial stage of the spiritual and psychological tendencies we will particularly consider from the point of view of evolution and the learning and growth aspects, for generally speaking. First of all, we go all the way back to the top, the very top of creation, where one single indivisible consciousness must take two poises in order to be able to have a creation. If the one stays simply what it is unknowable literally. When it chooses to know itself, naturally it knowing itself, there is automatically two. It as it chooses to know and it as it knows itself. Necessarily what it knows itself will be a limited knowing or can be drawn out unendingly. But what it is, the one who knows, is always complete. So there are already here we see at the very origin of things as if two poises. This in the more explicit way of the way the consciousness begins to know itself. It knows itself as sheer existence, existence that is utterly conscious, consciousness that has not only knowledge but also power of itself, so Chit Shakti, but consciousness that is blissful, so Sat Chit Ananda. In this already there is a duality from the sheer existence to the consciousness, the knowing of itself. But in the knowing is a dual power. It is a power not only to know but also to be. In knowing it can amplify what it knows, intensify, objectify, so that becomes the power, the creative energy, Chit Shakti. But all this belongs in the domain of consciousness. So we can say the dual poise is one of existence and then the emergent consciousness. One way of looking at it. Or we could say it is the subjective awareness, what it knows itself to be, and then what it draws out of itself to know as if objectively. So again, two poises. But I'm going through many such representations because necessarily the reality above is not reducible to just one mental idea. It is an intuitive experience, and so when we mentalize it, it takes multiple aspects. So, emerging from within, projecting outward. Again, the duality. All of these you will see reflect in us as human beings. When we are in deep thought, introspective mode, we turn within. What is it? What is it I want to be? What is it I am? What is it I want to express? What is it I want to create? And it's as if you're turning in to introspect, to dig inside. You find things and then you say, yes, this, and what is this? And you draw it out. And then it comes to a degree where it's on the brink of objectivization, and then you say, this now I will begin to express. And then it as if turns and is pushed and projected outward. Well, a similar movement takes place in the divine consciousness. All is known, and then yet certain things are drawn out. And as they are drawn out, there is a turning to objectify as if to itself. But that becomes the duality. Or we can say the consciousness itself of the Satchidananda has this aspect of knowledge and then power. Power to be, to actualize what it knows. Although it knows, it's not yet actualized until it enables it by empowering. Or we could look at the energy itself. That creative energy, and you can't say that doesn't have energy. Both have energy, both are energy. And we can say the distinction is the conceiving energy and then the manifesting energy. So when you begin to think in these terms, you find the dual poise, and then you need to find a word to capture this. But to capture all these, let's say, pairs of dualities, or rather this one experience and then that one experience, multifaceted. So in Sanskrit, the natural vocabulary is Purusha and Prakriti, or Ishvara and Shakti, the Lord and the energy of the Lord. But Purusha is the poise in which all is held, does not take a dynamic movement, it is still stable, complete in itself. Prakriti, the vocabulary, the Sanskrit word is projecting out, placing forward. Kriti is forming, creating. Kara, the same root as hand, or karma, the same root. The action, the poise of being, and then you may say the poise of becoming in English vocabulary. Or we will say in a different vocabulary, soul and nature. So these become the more accessible terms which philosophies will use. I'm bringing these terms last because necessarily these terms are deeply imbued with all kinds of associations and expectations and philosophical distinctions according to various schools, according to our individual mental associations and understandings. So initially I've described the feel of the experience, and then now we will give it a vocabulary for convenience, but know that we are speaking of something much more deep than just this very superficial idea. This was the first time I realized how this can even be completely differently understood was when we were talking in some context in a interfaith discussion. A rabbi who was there, he heard me say something like, Purusha is the static poise and Prakriti or nature is the dynamic poise. This is passive and that is active. And he says, that's interesting. In the Kabbalah, it is completely the reverse. We say it is the Purusha poise in their vocabulary, which is active, which has the will, and the Prakriti nature is passive to the will. Right? So if you speak of passivity and activity, you can completely switch the roles. And they're not wrong. And this is not wrong. We're actually speaking exactly the same things. The problem becomes of vocabulary. So yes, there is a passivity of nature to the active conceptual power of soul. Nature is passive to what the soul conceives and chooses to execute, and she executes passively. But on the other hand, he conceives and she flows. So both were right. It's just we understood those words differently or highlighted them differently. So I'm pointing this out because it's very easy to slip into misunderstanding if you latch on to the words. So use the word as pointer to the underlying sense of the experience of these two poises of a single consciousness. In fact, if we go deeper into the yoga tradition, in the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna describes 6 gradations of relationships between these two poises of consciousness, of soul and nature. There is in fact also a poise where the soul chooses to become passive to the play of nature. Although the soul conceives of the play, then it becomes passive in the play, and the nature entertains, seduces, hypnotizes the soul until it forgets who he is and feels itself a formation of nature. That's where we are today. We feel as if we are formed of the body, we are formed after our thoughts. If I stop thinking, if my body ceases to exist, I will cease to exist. That's that lowest poise. And then various stages in which the soul awakens to the relationship and then realizes that, oh yes, what it chooses, nature modifies. If it loses interest in the play in a particular way, then nature adapts the play to match what is his interest. And so he can choose. And so there are stages until eventually he becomes master of nature. But then he lifts nature until the nature and the soul are united as single consciousness taking two poises, liberated in their divinity. So that is the highest station, but then there are all these different relationships in the play possible in the actual unfolding in the cosmos. So essential relationship though, always, soul leads nature. Without soul, nature cannot exist. Without nature, you could say soul is unmanifest, not incomplete, unmanifest. So these are the dependencies between the two. Always soul leads, nature follows, because nature is power of soul expressing its free choice. Remember, we are not talking about men and women, set that aside. We are just talking of a spiritual principle of consciousness. So soul leads nature, Purusha leads Prakriti, always. And the consciousness within is essentially one, taking two different poises, different qualities, different action, different relationships. And so if we had to reduce all this into two keywords, and I will set aside the Sanskrit vocabulary, but two keywords in the English language which would capture as if the essence of this and the essence of that as poises, I would use the words stability and flow. And in the play between the two, the quality caught in these two, which distinguishes one from the other, you will see how this is also represented in various traditions in various ways. One of the most common symbols in which this duality is represented is in the Shivalinga in the Indian tradition. It is not a phallic symbol. That is a Western Freudian imposition. It has nothing to do with that. It is the creative power in its Purusha aspect as static power, and then in its Prakriti aspect as dynamic power. And the joining of these two and their relationship is represented. Now again, we will use words to draw, as if what we have tried to describe as an intuitive experience, to draw out elements of it in a more mental form. So what is the nature of the Purusha, the qualities associated with it? You see, it stands by itself, it is stable, it needs nothing, it is complete in itself. It is, simply. How would you represent that in a symbol? But it's not just that. It has also a sense of direction and purpose and focus before it becomes. So how do you represent that? Sheer existence, but with direction, with purpose, with a focal point, and yet complete. And then the second movement, as it flows, there is the flowing of what the purpose was, and the flowing flows freely. So you see, the Shivalinga is this cylindrical, as if dome-like cylindrical structure, which holds the Shiva aspect, the Purusha aspect. And then the flow from it emerges, flows out, literally like the waters flowing from a hill, the Ganga flowing down from the head of Shiva or from the mountain, surrounding all around and flowing around as a fluid, liquid, but flowing in all directions from this center. And yet the flow is not chaotic, it represents, it expresses that which is held. And so in the Shivalinga you have this base which is surrounding, and then from there it pours out. It pours out to become the whole creation. So the poise of the Shivalinga with the Shiva as well as the Shakti surrounding is a very significant and pretty accurate representation of this duality. You could remove the surrounding waters, just have this bare, empty, unexpressed. You could have the waters flowing, remove the center, and the waters are, well, without center, chaotic, flowing. What leads, which direction, nothing is set. The two united make for the union of Shiva and Shakti, which makes for the completeness and the manifestation. And then that pours out streaming and unfolds in space and time. That's the way the whole thing is symbolized in this. So all this is first to give you the spiritual foundations of this duality. Now, why should this duality represent itself in the human beings with two genders at all? So that question we will fully appreciate a little later, but first now we see how this duality streams in qualities of consciousness and the way this pairing becomes almost unavoidable throughout creation. And then we see that the soul naturally finds this aspect or that aspect of the experience more interesting, or a specialization in the whole scope of its free play. And so that's where we will see the almost inevitability of this double aspect, which in the biology becomes the two genders. But the double aspect in itself, free of the gender, is psychological qualities or emphasis of psychology on one or the other. So at all levels of manifestation, you'll find this play. Sri Aurobindo makes a reference to this, that in the soul's experience, there is somewhere a need to have a vehicle which aligns to more of this aspect or that aspect, or it may choose to align more with this or that. I'm going to read from that text. It's actually quite fascinating. It's part of his description in among the last writings where he is describing the supramental transformation. It's part of that series which is called the supramental manifestation upon earth. There he is discussing the divine body. And as part of that discussion, he says the sex principle, which is this distinction of two genders. It's not about sexuality, but the sex principle. But all recognition of the sex principle as apart from the gross physical indulgence of the sex impulse could not be excluded from a divine life upon earth. So in a divine life upon earth, that principle of the masculine and feminine would be there as a gender. It is there in life, plays a large part, and has to be dealt with. It cannot simply be ignored, merely suppressed or held down or put away out of sight. In the first place, it is in one of its aspects a cosmic and even a divine principle. It takes the spiritual form of the Ishvara and the Shakti, and without it there could be no world creation or manifestation of the world principle of Purusha and Prakriti, which are both necessary for the creation. Necessary too in their association and interchange for the play of its psychological working, and in their manifestation as soul and nature, fundamental to the whole process of the Leela. This is the part which is quite fascinating. So we have already discussed this aspect, Ishvara, Shakti. Even in the world creation, you need the dual poise and the manifesting of the Purusha and Prakriti, both necessary for creation. You cannot have one existing without the other. We have seen that. But necessary too in their association and interchange for the play of its psychological working. In the cosmos, the psychological working needs this interchange between these two principles. And their manifestation as soul and nature is fundamental to the whole process of the Leela. So we'll take a few examples of how this happens. But for now, in the divine life itself, an incarnation, or at least in some form, a presence of these two powers or their initiating influence through their embodiments or representatives would be indispensable for making the new creation possible. Interesting. So it's as if, since these two principles have a play, and we see it in nature, we will take examples of it, then at some point the principle also needs to find a means of embodying, finding a body for itself and expressing itself as a conscious principle to manifest in a divine play, isn't it? If each of the gods as conscious powers, cosmic creative powers, would want to manifest in a body and experience this and even participate as an individualized form, well, why not these principles which are also conscious powers? So an incarnation, or at least in some form a presence of the two powers, or their initiating influence through their embodiments, having a body, or through their representatives. So you as an individual could say, yes, I would like to incarnate or manifest this particular aspect, express this more intensely, more completely, and then perhaps change later. So your embodiment could be able to choose to align to one or other, incarnate one or other. Just as you may choose to say, I will incarnate my poetic consciousness, I will incarnate my scientific side, I will incarnate my adventurous side. So why not? So if you look at it in this way, because these are such powerful, essential cosmic principles, yes, there will also be embodiments, incarnations, for which nature, interestingly, has been preparing for a very, very, very long time to create bodies which are specialized in their alignment to this or that aspect. That's where we find the gender and the biology. We will come to that later, but right now I'm just setting the base for this understanding. And nature has actually tried to look at Purusha, Prakriti. Yes, I must capture. And of course, she's going from below, building with forms and pieces, joining them in an imitation of consciousness. So it is a bit of a caricature. Everything is symbolic, though. Everything is symbolic. The biological distinctions are symbolic. Of course, they may have a functional aspect, but they're all symbolic. And it is there that we may get the Freudian perversion of seeing the phallus in the Shivalinga. It has nothing to do with that. But The symbolism in the biological form itself and the specialization of the forms, which we will look at later, is a result of nature attempting to capture certain characteristics, psychological principles of each of these specializations of consciousness. So, there's more to this text, but at this point I will skip it. It's not relevant for our discussion. Those of you who are interested can look at it separately. So, I come back to our discussion of this duality. When we now look down, top down, across the worlds, we see these two poises embodied naturally in the subtler worlds. So we have the gods, and for those of you who are familiar with the Vedic deities, you have the masculine and the feminine deities, isn't it? Or, as it is in the Puranas represented, it's much more humanized, they take on human forms. A similar thing takes place in the Greek mythology, where you have the masculine and the feminine gods and goddesses, but they've already become so humanized that a lot of deeper knowledge is lost. Now, the Indian tradition, we still retain although a lot of distortions have come from the Veda to the Puranic phase, you still retain one idea that for every masculine deity there is a feminine deity and there's a partnership between the two. That's interesting. So it's as if one represents this aspect, the other represents that aspect of the same consciousness. Among the Greek gods, that pairing is not so obvious unless you go to very ancient texts, and there you might find certain things, or you may even find sometimes that the same deity is more masculine or more feminine, taking different roles and so on. So we see there literally a masculine deity and a feminine deity. Whenever there is action to be performed on earth, the masculine sends as emissary the feminine deity. Interesting. And there you see this play of the dual aspects. But still, psychological, spiritual principle, remember, don't reduce it to human genders. In further down, other levels, higher mental, higher vital, and so on, you'll find the archangelic, angelic entities. Similarly, even you will find in the Western tradition, when they speak of archangels and angels, you'll find sometimes masculine, feminine, or they're just blurred and they don't have a clear gender, which is often the case, in fact, because they do not have organs on all those planes. They do not need organs. You can, of course, change your body shape, put on any kind of organ or shape, but it's a artificial imposition. The consciousness itself does not need that. So you will see in European mystical Christian art, the archangels are painted as almost feminine male. So it's as if they are capturing this aspect, but not quite clear. Interesting. Even in their representation, the biological organs are not seen to distinguish male or female. Where the artists have a mystical perception, this is most common. We have also in the Indian tradition other beings of the vital worlds, Apsaras and Gandharvas, again female and male. And again in their interplay there is this relationship. Among the lower vital beings, you will find as they approach the material domain closer, they tend to have more distinctly organs. Otherwise, again, it's just quality of consciousness, more feminine, more masculine. I'm going to highlight this because finally you have to look at human beings in terms of this. Not so much the organs, but the masculine, feminine quality of consciousness, and then understand how the mind works, masculine or feminine, how the life energies flow, masculine or feminine, how the body itself is formed in its flow and in its specializations, irrespective of the specifics of organs. Because these things are going to last. The organs may or may not. These things will last. And these things are more essentially true. So, qualitative difference is what we are going to focus upon. So, what are the psychological qualities and what is their interplay? First, we will look at it in a more objective play in the cosmos. You will see there is a dual poise everywhere. Wherever something is happening, there has to be a dual poise. If there are not two in contact, in pressure, in collision, in stress, nothing is created. It is the stress of two principles, two forces And the stress building, intensifying, leads to the creation of a third or something new, a new principle emergent. Very simply, you want to light a fire, you take a stone and strike it against another stone, right? One stone has to stay fixed, the other has to move. Of course, in the domain of relativity, you could move both, but still, end of the day, relative to each other, each feels either itself moving and the other static, or itself static and the other moving. So the dual poise is inherent in any such interaction. In electricity, for example, when electricity flows, there are two things, voltage and current. What is the difference? Voltage is a stress. I will use our deeper vocabulary, in the ether. A stress in the ether creates a separation in the tension. But current doesn't flow necessarily unless the circuit is closed. So voltage is that stress, it is the static aspect. It holds, it can stay unendingly, doing no work, losing nothing. You can hold a voltage just like that, unendingly, indefinitely, in a capacitor. That's what happens. Now you close the circuit and the voltage immediately causes current to flow, and current can only flow. Current cannot be static. Voltage cannot flow. Voltage is only static. Interesting. And if you do not have current, the voltage is unmanifest. But you cannot have current without voltage. Interesting. You see how fundamental this is. You just have to go deep enough and you'll find, this dual poise is there. And when the two are there, then you have the electricity, you have the heat, the light, the computer, the mobile phone runs. Otherwise, nothing. In the biology, you have something which is static and something which is dynamic. Well, the bone and the muscle. Without the bone, you could not hold the muscle. The muscle would just collapse as a lump, isn't it? But without the muscle, the bone could not move, could not express itself. One is rigid, unmoving, the other is moving, not rigid at all. Interesting. And combination of these all over the body make for the ability of us to be able to move and express ourselves physically. Look around you again in nature. You see a river flowing. When you see a river is flowing, against what? There has to be a bank, there has to be the earth against which the river flows. Without earth, no river. Without river, earth is dry, no life. You have a flame, it gives off heat and light. Without the flame, there is no heat and light. But without the heat and light, the flame, it's just a beautiful painting. It does nothing, it cannot express itself. Or the classic example which I have always used to draw the analogy of relationship between Purusha and Prakriti is this canvas and the painting. The canvas is the foundation upon which the painter flows with the brush. The colors flow, let's say. If the canvas moves with the brush as the brush paints, and the canvas moves with it, nothing is created. Canvas has to be steady so that brush can move against it. If canvas is loose, as the brush moves, you will get a distortion. But the more solid, the more rigid, the more permanent, immovable the canvas, the more violent can be the strokes of the colors, the more complex and rich, and the more detailed. If the canvas is not sufficiently taut, you try to paint fine details, they will not hold. Or take another example, you take a sculptor chipping away on stone. If you take soft stone, it's easy to chip, but you can't make precision. You cannot make fine lines, fine hair. You cannot make it. Because it's too rigid, because it's too soft. But if you take the hardest stone, you take the granite, for example, very hard to chip, but precisely because of that you can make very precise fine lines and it will hold, it won't break up, it won't crumble. So the harder the resistance, the more fine, the more rich, the more diverse the play that is possible. Interesting. Think about it. On the other hand, if there is not that rich play of light, of color, of form, then the rigidity is bare, blank. I stand before a canvas, infinite potential, as if all possible paintings are existent at the same time in it. What do you see? None of them. Or you see all of them, but none is expressed, none is manifest. In order to bring forward something, it has to be a rock solid, stable, static. And then the full violence of an entire universe exploding can be supported by it. So the canvas painting becomes another good analogy of this. In the whole universe, you think in terms of a canvas and a painting. But I said this is true of all operations of nature, for the existence itself of the universe, but also in all creative processes. Wherever two things combine to create a third, to give birth to something new, you'll find the same law operation. I'm taking some very accessible examples. Hydrogen and oxygen giving birth to water. Water is neither hydrogen nor oxygen. It's not a gas at all, right? And what is fascinating about this, and the reason I'm taking this as an example, hydrogen is everywhere in the universe. There is nowhere in the universe that you don't have hydrogen. Even in empty space, there is hydrogen. Maybe greatly spread out, but there are hydrogen molecules. Literally, it's as if they appear out of nowhere. Why? Because hydrogen is the most basic thing. One proton, one electron is all you need. And what does the sun do? The sun puts out these gigantic bursts of solar wind, which is what? Protons at high speed. And then the sun is also generating electricity. It's also throwing out electrons. So eventually, anywhere you are in the universe, eventually you'll find these protons and it will attract an electron and the two will combine and there will be hydrogen. Or literally they emerge out of the underlying substratum of what they call vacuum energy. Literally, hydrogen is being produced simultaneously everywhere in space. And then the other thing, oxygen, which is fascinating. Anywhere you go, on the moon, any planet, everything is oxidized already. So we don't really know where it came from, but it's there. And when there is an oxidized, let's say iron oxidized, so you have rust as substance on the moon. When the solar wind comes and hits, you have the proton, hydrogen atom, electron, electricity because of static charge, and it literally eats up the oxygen, separates it and forms water. And I'm taking this example because this means everywhere in the universe that there is hydrogen, which is everywhere, and there is oxygen, which is anywhere there's any planet. The two will combine, there will be water. But it needs the combination of these two. You cannot have water otherwise. You cannot have life otherwise. You will now use masculine feminine principle combining to create life. Okay, which one is masculine feminine? You could say it could be either, but think about the role they play and it's obvious which you will call what. I will take another example for this, electric charge. So the hydrogen atom itself we saw is a proton electron combining. It's a masculine feminine principle because they are opposite charges. Electricity is electron and negative charge and positive charge combining or joining, isn't it, or separating. Which would you call positive? Which would you call negative? It could be arbitrary. Any I could call masculine, any I could call feminine. Doesn't matter. Until you observe carefully how it actually happens in nature. Notice one of these flows, the other does not flow. So when you have many atoms together in a molecular structure, it's a piece of iron. You take a piece of metal. Let's say I have a coin here. You take a piece of metal. It's shining because there is the surface electrons of all the atoms and they cause a field which reflects light. That's why metals are shiny. They are conductors. Conductors tend to be shiny for this reason, because of the free flow of electrons. What's happening is when two atoms come together, they share an electron which jumps across them and which holds them together. At least that's the model we have in current physics. The electrons are flowing, the protons are stuck, they are stable, they become the basis for the electrons to flow around. Interesting. So which is Purusha, which is Prakriti? in their role, in their relation, it becomes obvious. Think about it. Similarly, we could say hot air, cold air, wherever there's heat and cold. So hot air will rise, cold air will fall. Immediately it creates a wind flow. But you need both. If all is evenly cold or hot, no wind, no rain. Hot air rises, cold air drops, causing wind. When the two collide, causing rain, giving birth. Which would you call masculine, feminine? Well, you can see how the principle works. Cold settles, hot activates, rises. So you know which you would call what. So sometimes it seems arbitrary in an operation, but the point is there's a double principle always. And if not for the combination of the two principles, there is no real creation. The positive and negative charges will create the spark, which will launch the rain, it will release it. So all of this really comes back again to the essential qualities which I spoke of as stability and flow, static, dynamic. And the greater the stability, the greater the potential for the flow. And so we find a very interesting complementarity between them. Both are needed. Both should be there in the right proportion and in their right relation. And then anything can be created. So all this was still to describe things on a psychological, cosmic level of operation. We are still not mapping it specifically to gender or human biology and so on. Into this one could do many more examples of how this works, and especially in the subtler worlds these things become much more objectified. You can literally invoke or amplify certain qualities, as in dream state when you create things. But now we will bring this whole discussion to their encasement in the material and particularly the biological vehicles. So the biological form, which we then call gender, because of the nature of the physical matter, rigidity, persistence in its stability in form, binding in form, the result is that these psychological qualities, as they enter, or even their spiritual origins, as they enter into the biology, they tend to become rigid, they tend to get fixed, they tend to be reduced and limited, and into them then the biology also infuses certain exaggerated tendencies and forms. We may call them instincts or drives. And then one more thing which is very specific to the biology, because of the rigidity, any change has to go slow and has to be rhythmic, through rhythms, through stages. So automatically these qualities also undergo stages and timing in their unfoldment. Now, all this that I have described is purely at the level of principle of encasement in biology of any spiritual or psychological powers or principles. Anything. Now we come to the human beings and the encasement that we experience, not only as souls incarnating, but also bringing with us a certain template, let's say model of personality, of mind and vital body. As soon as you plug into the biology, all these things begin to grip you. Rigidity, limiting of capacities, binding into instincts and drives, unfolding through stages and at specific timings. You look at the human being, the stages of our unfoldment of psychological capacities or spiritual potential. We are as if limited by the body. Until the brain grows sufficiently complex, you cannot even incarnate the full potential of your mind. So it's as if your mind's capacity, especially when it's a more mature soul and a mature personality, is as if sticking out of the biology. It cannot fully incarnate. It's out there. You can access it. You have access to your higher intelligence by, so to say, stepping out of the biology. You step back into the biology and it's numbing, dulling, darkening. but your mind is here. And the same with your life force. You have the full vitality, but the body cannot bear it. If you were to infuse it, it would be too much, too intense. And the same with the soul. If the soul is very mature, very strong, very developed, it's as if half out, half in, because the biology is too small, too limiting to fit almost. Isn't it? So where is our real life? It's much more outside than inside. And this is what you see in very young children. They live half out, half in, and therefore their imaginary world is so vivid. As vivid as if you were daydreaming, but literally stepping out of the body in your subtle body. Except you're bound in the gross body and yet you're half out. So sometimes they see things, beings, or sense things, and then interpret them through reflection of images. But increasingly, as the body begins to grow, the sensations and experiences which are very specific and narrow to the biology, senses and functions, they tend to, so to say, attract, pull and plug in. The body literally pulls you and binds you into this. And so there comes this point where you suddenly begin to lose all that access. It recedes. And it's a necessary stage for you to fully embody. Grip into, literally it's like if you have clothes, you put your arm inside your sleeves. You put your head through the collar. And then you are now fully embodied, fitting into the body. And the body has, so to say, caught up to the extent that it can. Naturally it has reduced you to its incapacity or capacity. And there we are. But what is it you're embodying? What is the biological vehicle supporting or not or distorting? So thankfully, nature did not make vehicles which are monotone. She deliberately tried to bias these vehicles to become better receptacles for the masculine principle or the feminine principle. And this is important because the specialization is necessary for the completeness and for the creativity. It does not mean you as a consciousness are bound to one specialization. You are conscious, you are free. Soul is free. Soul may choose in this incarnation to highlight this aspect or that aspect, or even during the incarnation choose to highlight one and develop the other, integrate both, change between them. And again, this has nothing to do with genderism and transgender. We're talking of something totally different. We do not mix in those ideas now. So there are phases in life where you take the poise which is expressing more the masculine aspect, and then there are phases where you express more the feminine aspect. I remember it was very interesting for me. I look back at that period when I was with my teacher and he was in the body till the age of 25, my teacher MP Pandit. Especially after I had completed my formal education in the school, which must have been age 21 or something. Those 4 years that I had with him, with less than 4, were something so extraordinary. I remember I had just completed my education, and of course there were those plans, I would like to do this and that in the ashram community. And suddenly all that I had hoped for, I wanted to teach in the school, and suddenly the teachers who had asked me to teach, they backed out. For no reason. They said, we don't want to get involved in politics. So there was something happening behind the scenes. And just plop, it was cut off. And I was left with a blank. And so I said, everybody has we have a 1.5 month vacation. And I said, I don't need a vacation. I'm going to start work straight away. Normally students sit for 1.5 months doing nothing in their vacation time and then join the ashram with the next scholar year, which is kind of silly. I said, well, I'm already a part of the ashram. I don't need to go through a vacation for that. So I said, I'll just join. And I went to the person who was giving the work, Ravindraji, and he gave me some work which I came home, I just accepted, and I came home and gave the slip to my teacher, and he looked at it and he said, no. He said, this will harm spiritually, the particular work that he had given, because of the things it involved, interaction with certain things. So I said, okay, what should I do? He said, no, don't. You tell him that you're not yet ready and that you will look at it later. And then later, Jayantilal on his own approached and asked for me to be taken to the archives, and I went in a very different direction. But at that moment, my teacher asked me, what do you want to do? There was a choice. Should I accept Jayantilal's offer or somebody else had? And I had a choice. I could have exercised it. And I chose consciously to let go all my personal preferences, to bear myself. And I said, whatever you choose. Literally as if to the mother. From that point on began a period of 1.5 years, which was intensely deep spiritual, where he was literally infusing and pouring experiences day to day. I've shared some of these at times before. But I remember that state I was in was this, and I could describe it in terms of the psychological qualities we're discussing, totally feminine and utterly receptive. Whatever he chose, I was there to be molded. And much later, after he left his body, I had completely switched the role and began to take charge and make my own decisions and lead my life and so on. It switched between two different modes, let's say. Again, it has nothing to do with biology and gender. We're talking of psychological qualities and emphasis. But to be able to hold that poise and to be in that state of total receptivity, it led to some extraordinary experiences with him. I remember towards the end, it was a month or two before he passed away, I was sitting near his feet, and we just sit like this and just in a state of some immersion, and the consciousness had gone so far in identifying with him. Even physically, I was experiencing something, and then there was a mosquito that sat on his foot, and it was just near to me. So I reached out, and as I would when I see a mosquito sit, I go with a single finger, pop. I don't do a whack, I don't do scratch, just quite minimum. So I looked at his foot, mosquito, I reached out and I did pop. And at the moment when my finger touched, I felt as if I had touched my own body. And that was a degree of the identification and consciousness that I felt with him. And all this I can appreciate now in retrospect and see what it means in terms of consciousness and what the potential, the spiritual potential implied and all that. And this is simply to say that this is the poise which would be normally called feminine, which is the natural relationship of nature to soul, of Shakti to Ishvara, represented in essential quality now here. So that's why I'm using this term feminine. Again, nothing to do with male and female. We're talking of consciousness quality. And then there was an unfolding, a phase where something else had to be taken up, and then eventually these two to be integrated in relation to the divine you open and you receive, but then in terms of execution, you have to take a poise. So it's very interesting, this poise is described in the bhakti tradition in a certain way, that the bhakti tradition says all human souls are female and God is the only male. And they use the vocabulary of Purusha and Prakriti. But it's not about biology, gender, female. It's about this feminine poise of opening to receive and serve the Lord, manifest the Lord, execute His whim and fancy, His will. That's the relationship of the nature to the Lord. You have a similar idea even in the mystical Christianity, where they will say that when people choose to become nuns in the church, then Christ is the husband and they are wives of Christ. So symbolically these things are held, but because they are identified with gender, then a lot of other confusions could follow. There are also certain Upanishads which use the same vocabulary. There is only one male, all else is expressing female. So it's speaking of one Ishvara, one Lord, and then nature, all is nature in relation to the Lord. So if we are careful not to confuse with the gender, catch the psychological principle, you will find something quite fascinating. Within all of us, both poises exist. In relation to the divine, we hold this poise. In relation to what we are, in relation to our soul even, it is a certain poise. Our soul itself in relation to the divine is a certain poise. In relation to our work, in relation to different things, different situations, the psychological poise changes, and it's a blend of these two, constantly a play. You have an idea, you want to translate it and execute it. In that poise of ideation, you take the masculine poise. When you now translate it, it is the feminine creative poise, where you flow now to execute, to become what you feel yourself to be, and you flow in that movement. And then everything goes fine as long as you're fully attuned, you've forgotten yourself. You are the becoming naturally, effortlessly, until something pops up, something hurdles, some problem, and there's a bump, you pause, there is no flow, the flow is broken. What do you do next? You step back, realign to the vision. And now, in relation to this changed circumstance, you flow again, around it, through it, breaking it, whatever form it may be in relation to that barrier. So we oscillate between these two poises within us, the masculine and the feminine, if you had to use that soul or nature poise, visioning and executing of vision, isn't it? All the time. If that be the case, then obviously there would be times where we might find ourselves enjoying one aspect more than the other, or lives where we may develop one aspect more than the other. And at that point, if our vehicle is so formed as to support that line of experience, that would be helpful. Or if it was not, then the very fact that we make a repeated choice of one of these poises over the other would tend to mold the vehicle and shape it to express that poise more, which then would be transmitted in the genetics into the progeny. Think about it, isn't it? So you could have actually a whole lineage in a family which highlights one aspect, or which is the gift that nature gives us because of the two genders. She makes these vessels such that in one gender this aspect is more naturally, effortlessly tending to be highlighted. In the other, that aspect or that consciousness tends to be effortlessly more highlighted. And then she uses the linkage between the two genders to create a new birth, a new form of the species. So she's as if looking up there at that play of the creative consciousness and replicating it in a bit of a caricature, and yet in the process creating specialized molds. And it is to this specialization that we will now spend a little time in exploration to understand both its limitations as well as its strengths. And to what extent are we really bound by the biological and even psychological specializations? To what extent are we free? And to what extent can we utilize this even for in our soul's growth, and then eventually in our way of learning or in our ability to assist others to learn, in helping them grow. There are books you will find today which highlight these differences primarily on the biological basis. Most of those emerge from a very reductionist viewpoint, which is largely Freudian and the reductionist Western model of psychology, which is biology based, that all thought, emotion are a product of biology. That being the starting point for much of this material, being the nature of the physical sciences. So they will always say, go back to the brain finally. Brain is one interesting thing. It of course has physical distinctions, but the psychological distinctions are far more flexible than the physical distinctions. Even which part of the brain is used for what function tends to be a fluid flow or can shift easily. So they have a big problem matching the psychology with the biology, but still. And then you have these very interesting books titled provocatively, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, treating literally as two different species of psychological types and tending to exaggerate necessarily because that's how you sell, but that's how you make a point. And so we will look at some of these tendencies of, we may say that it is a kind of a the word slips me. You may just say it's a social habit or a bias and so on, but it is useful to highlight to the brink of exaggeration perhaps, to make the point and then recognize that nature is always building every possibility in between. So what we have is a cluster of psychological characteristics, and leaning towards them tends to be the masculine, and another cluster of psychological qualities and leaning towards them tends to be feminine, and there are large overlaps also in some of their functions, and in the overlap there's still a tilt this way or that way. And then in the way nature embodies these, necessarily we saw we have both. The two factors are, but one tends to be reduced, one dominates. Or in another somewhat, the other tends to be reduced, one dominates. So you'll say this one he's a very masculine man, a very feminine man, a woman. Or, here it happens, a very feminine man, a very masculine woman. Still one of them dominates. And then there are very few people in whom you'll find these integrated so well that you cannot really say just this or that. And yet, they would prefer to highlight one aspect or another, but tend to be able to flow quite easily between both facets. But the biology would tend to give a certain aspect. And at that point, it's interesting, they begin to resemble the angelic types. On the face, you will see a certain softness which is feminine, and yet a certain firmness which you would call masculine. But they're not contradictory. They complement each other in an aesthetic beauty which is almost spiritual or idealistic in some kind. Or in the body, the same thing. And you will see this in the gymnasts. You remember I had spoken many sessions ago of two characteristics that the mother spoke of regarding the supramental working in matter. So she was asked specifically what would be the signs that the supermind is working in matter. And she said two things. First was change in weather patterns. And the second thing, I think in that discussion I forgot to mention this, the second was change in the human biology. And she said the tendency of the human biology would be that the distinctions between the male and female form would tend to become less and less, and this would be seen first among the gymnasts and those who work to develop the body consciousness. So I've spoken of the weather patterns. You can view that discussion. The weather would become more temperate, the extremes of heat would become cooler, the extremes of cold would become warmer. So we see both things happening, confusing the scientists very much. They don't know if it's global warming or cooling, so they just say climate change. But even that is not the way they think it is. Setting aside that, we come to the biology, this tendency. And it's part of the working of the supramental consciousness in the human biology, very indirectly, reflection of reflection of reflection, but still nudging, nudging, nudging. And perhaps there's a lot of junk that's coming in through the heavy mixture of hormones we're dumping into the waters, into our food, and through the plastic, which has very large quantity of hormone mimics, which are estrogen mimics. So you take a plastic water bottle, leave it in the sun, it leaches plastic, which is estrogen mimic. You drink the water and it's like drinking estrogen. So it really messes up the hormonal balance in human beings, and especially in children, in adults, the body sometimes cannot manage it, you get illnesses, all kinds of things. So there's a huge amount of that confusion also. In the lakes in the United States, which is less polluted than India, the hormones through the wastewater from the city, after it has been purified and processed, the hormones are not gone. The hormones from the wastewater going into the pure lake as plain water is messing up the fish hormone to a degree that male fish have female organs, female fish have male organs, and messing up totally the biological balance. Now you could say, this is causing a change. Yes, of course. But also the supramental consciousness, being what it is, uses anything to assist a process. But what it does is smooth, without distortions. The distortions may come from the hormones, but it may pick out of that distortion a component which it uses for something more smooth. So let's set aside that aspect of the distortions from chemical and other causes, and look at the human body as you work on the body consciousness, and the body consciousness opens to an influence or is more receptive to a higher influence. The shape of that influence is to make it more archetypal, less exaggerated in form of the masculine or feminine, and yet holding a particular, as a container, a certain ability to hold those qualities. And so you will see among the Olympic gymnasts a strong masculine aspect, and yet the body's person is totally feminine. Or a male gymnast, you'll see the strong masculine, and yet the suppleness of the feminine. In the female, similarly. So you see something quite extraordinary happening today. It's happening slowly, but in those in whom there is some working on the body consciousness, it's happening. So all this is to set a background that yes, we will take examples which show certain extremes, but don't bind yourself to the extreme. Recognize it's a psychological quality, and the biology is a container which is meant to support and not intended to limit. It is at best a starting point, at worst a starting point, out of which you can build anything. Maybe it takes longer, maybe it's harder, but eventually you can. You are free in consciousness. So, whatever you may be told biologically, including illnesses, remember it all represents a starting point. Consciousness is greater than biology, can override, reshape, recast entirely. If the body is conscious, if it is flexible, more easily. If body is less conscious, more rigid, it takes longer and more difficult. But it can be done. So, with that background, let's look at differences. Perhaps the most significant difference in the biology structure itself is in the brain. Because everywhere else you can say, yes, it's similar, you have the same muscle structure, bone structure. Your muscles are softer, mine are harder. Mine are stronger, yours are because softer, weaker, perhaps. But so that's not so rigid. Biological organs we ignore because they are not central to what we are discussing. In the brain is where you see the biggest difference. So you have the left brain and the right brain, and between them there's a linking point, linking cluster, which links and transfers signals from one side to the other. This structure is larger in female, dramatically larger, smaller in men. Obviously, from a purely mechanical circuit point of view, it means there is greater communication between left and right brain in women. More rich, more spread out. Literally every part of the brain can somehow link to the other half of the brain with minimum effort. In men it is narrow. So this part does not have direct access. Some parts have direct access across, other parts have to go through and get through translators. But in the men, the smaller part has a richer number of connections. So nature always compensates. Having made it smaller, it's as if certain powers of the left brain and the right brain are as if separated, exaggerated in separation, but although separated, when they communicate, the communication can be much more detailed, though narrow, specific, object oriented. In women, it is larger with less connections overall, so you have a broad band connection, very complex, rich interactions, but spread out, flowing, not focused. Practically what this means, because the left brain is the analytic side and the right brain is the synthetic side, the left brain is the outwardly turned, the right brain is more intuitively turned. Practically it means in women the intuitive axis of work between the two is stronger, but the result also is the rational aspect can get overwhelmed by the emotional aspect. In men, because of this narrowing, the rational aspect can maintain its separation from the emotions easily, almost effortlessly. When it chooses to link, it can of course have a rich connection, but through a narrow passage, so it maintains its identity and separateness. In practice, to the extent you are embodied and identified with the body, in a man the thought will feel as if floating separate from emotions, or at least he can pull out his thoughts from emotions. You still need to do that, otherwise we can easily wallow in emotions. You having done that, and which is easier to do because of this separation, he can maintain this even when emotions are distressed. So I'm extremely upset about this, but I can hold my cool in the thought and persist in holding this. And you'll see the man who's angry, still doing his work, restraining. But in a woman, the two things will tend to collide and flow more easily. Again, remember, we're talking generally, so don't blame me for sounding too cliched. That's the word I was looking for. It may sound cliched, but recognize this principle behind, and then you can see each one has their own variation, and then you can work upon it and create separations. You can work upon it as a male and create blendings and join. All that is possible. But this is our natural, effortless starting point. With no effort, this is where you are. And in a woman, there'll tend to be this collision. Emotions will overwhelm until the mind loses its objectivity. Or the rational mind will be sucked into the emotions and made to justify an emotion of the moment. And 10 minutes later, when the emotions have changed, the same mind would be used to justify this completely opposite state. And if you confront the person saying, you just told me this, now you tell me this, that's how I feel. And the justification is my feeling, what it is justified. You'll see this often happen in conflicts between men and women. And sometimes they're not conscious. This can happen with men also, but it tends to happen more easily in the female brain structure biology. Remember, brain is only reducing along grooves what is much more fluid psychology in the subtle body. You step out of the brain in dream state and you have full freedom of the subtle body's actual development. So men stepping out will find a very different experience of the relationship between emotions and mind. But it will be what you are in your current evolutionary state, the degree to which you have integrated or not, the state or level at which you primarily tend to live in your current evolutionary development, and so on. But the moment you come back into the body, shloop, this separation in the male, in the female, this blending or whatever form it takes. There are specific faculties which are activated in the male brain more easily because of certain hormonal, let's say, triggers, and specific faculties in the female brain which are activated because of different hormonal triggers. I'll give an example, and I found this very interesting because I was watching a documentary of a woman who had, gender dysphoria. She was convinced she was a male in a female body. We'll be discussing all that later on. But so while she was convinced about this, they made her undergo this. Not what is happening today. Today the whole thing is a very fashionable mess. This is going back 25 years before this fashion started. It was not a trans fashion. It was a real thing. She describes how she was undergoing these hormonal injections of testosterone. And then she said as the weeks progressed, she found that where earlier she would cry freely when distressed emotionally, now she found as if the tears would not flow. She wants to cry, inside she is crying, but the tears don't flow. And that was the transition into the male activation of the brain, and certain things had begun to change. And this is something very interesting, which often men have difficulty understanding when women cry easily. The tears just flow, because there's a flowing character psychologically. I mean, oh my God, then you must be in really distress, because for men to cry is an extreme. But men have a different experience, which is quite fascinating, and I've understood it because of the experience more conscious, being more conscious in the subtle body. Literally you experience tears flowing, and they are tears in the subtle body. But the biology doesn't have tears. To the extent you are half separate from the gross physical body, you may experience the flow of tears, but in the biology it's blocked. It's not going through. And it needs as if a strong push, and then finally the thing breaks and a few tears may shed. Half a tear, one tear, and that still takes a huge pressure on the other side to get to that point. And that's why the men think when a woman cries, there must be a huge pressure. They know it may not be. It may just be a thing. And she cries, she feels relieved. She's free of it. For men, it's not relief. It's a very different experience. I'm giving this as an example to show you how the whole machinery works because of biology. But there are other faculties which kick in. Faculties which are specific to the reasoning mind, which are tied to the hormones. And so as those hormones kick in, the thought process begins to shift and tilt into what is more characteristically male. So this woman who is going through that process finds her thought process shifting, her emotions shifting, separations and things taking place, and faculties kicking in. Now here's the interesting thing. If you take a map, let's say you have a picture, you have a text even, and you're going to read this. Okay, I'm going to take a more interesting text. We have a text here. Somebody shows it across the table so that it is upside down to me. For you now, upside down. Can you read what it says? Or you have a map. You are navigating in the old days with a paper map. Your road is straight in front of you. In your map, you're pointing north, but you might be driving south. So the male brain can just rotate in the head effortlessly. Okay, we're going south. But out there we're going the other way. But in the mind, the image is rotated. No problem. Female brain has a huge problem in rotation. She will have to turn the map around to match it with the direction of the road, and then the text becomes upside down. It's very confusing, switching between this and that. It's a problem. There's another faculty to this, three-dimensional visualization. So, unfortunately here I don't have a good example, but if you take a engineering drawing where a complex piece of metal part, let's say an engine part, piston, let's say, has been drawn from the front, from the side, from the top. The three flat drawings. In your mind you have to construct a three-dimensional shape. Men can do it. It's difficult for both. Men can do it easily, comparatively. Women have a very, 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 very hard time. Left to themselves without training. Again, we are speaking of biases which are built in into the brain priorities. And this is the reason why if you go into the engineering field, you get many more men than women. Unless you go into software, then it's a different thing. If you go into mechanical engineering, men have a field day because it's easier to do that function. Now, if women had defined the field, they would have drawn pictures in a different way, but there was no other way to do it in those days to hold that kind of precision. Today, because you do 3D visualizations and you can rotate on the screen, it becomes somewhat easier. Still, rotating in the head is a precursor to rotating on the screen. How do you fit one piece? Now in your mind you have, let's say, a complex piece and you have another complex piece and there's a hollow here. Will this fit into that? How do you rotate it to fit into that? The male brain can do the rotation and fit easily, the female brain cannot. Now the female brain has other advantages which male brain cannot. I'll come to that also. So you see here a vehicle optimized for what? For the masculine functions or qualities, and at the loss of some other faculties. Now in the female brain you find one interesting characteristic, which is that it can operate in 2 or 3 directions at the same time. So one of the things which is quite fascinating from a male point of view, you will see often when women meet in a light banter, you'll find them talking at the same time. And if a man is sitting there, he gets very confused. Are they even listening to each other? You try to listen to one and someone else is talking, you're switching between. And in the woman's head, you're listening and following. Of course, it's superficial light talk. It's not detailed, serious, so it doesn't demand much. But you're listening and following maybe 2 or 3 conversations at the same time. By extension, you could be doing some work which involves full attention and still listening at the same time and maybe conversing at the same time, which for the male brain becomes extremely difficult. It tends to switch. You have to go back and forth to get to that same level of, and it's effortless for both. Now, if you think about it, go deep into the principle behind, what do you see here? The flow of the Prakriti, which is multifaceted, and the focal point of the Purusha one pointed focus, objective purpose, visualizing, conceptualizing, maybe in complex, and then Prakriti flowing into multifaceted execution, fulfilling. And these are the two characteristic patterns that nature has highlighted and activated as if as a starting point. You don't have to do anything, this is your starting point. Now, from an evolutionary point of view, there are certain benefits to this, because there are natural partnerships possible, natural benefits to each of the roles, etc. But it's not for that. It's to create vehicles for these two clusters of qualities, and for the souls which want to develop that or align to that, nature is giving you a vehicle here, incarnate in this vehicle, and you'll find all your powers and faculties oriented to this kind of experience. That's the idea from nature's point of view. And because there's a complementarity up there, there's a natural complementarity down here, right? It's a consequence of that from what nature is trying to imitate. It's not that nature created two genders to try to make them complementary. That's an incidental result of the fact that they were complementary up there. At least this is the deeper truth. Superficially, you could say yes, of course. But what this means is, there is a natural complementarity between these two poises, even while it is a limiting poise for each. So, I want to come to this aspect a little later perhaps, so we'll skip this for now, but just keep this in mind. I want to dwell a little more on other differences. In the male, or in the female in relation to the male, the nervous system has more fine nerve endings. So let's say the skin patch. Take the back of your hand, draw a 1 centimeter square. Count the number of nerve endings. In a female, there are many more than in the male. Dramatically many more. Which means if you touch the skin, on the male skin and on the female skin, on the male skin the sensation, let's say, is a certain quantity. In the female skin, the same touch will be far richer, far more complex, with many more nuances, simply because there are more nerve endings. Just as an analogy, if you had to do that, touch the lip, which has, for all men and women, has more nerve endings. Touch the lip and touch the back of the hand. Notice the sensation difference. In women, the sensation here would be much closer to that. But this is true all over the body. Now, one of the implications of this is not only that the women will feel more any touch, any contact, but also in the consciousness they feel more embodied in the body, more plugged in, because the sensations of the body are more rich, the consciousness is drawn into the body. This is a very interesting observation Sri Aurobindo makes. I'm a little hesitant about sharing some of this because they seem so stereotyped that people could accuse you of being sexist. But you have to understand that these things are biologically rooted and therefore also have psychological implications. So he says in one of the conversations, in one of the talks, I'll get you let me see if I have the exact text here. There are a few things, so this is one. Okay, I have not copied this out. So, but he says something like this: the woman tends to be much more physically, much more connected to life, and she tends to bring the man into connection with life, and this is part of nature's purpose. If you just read it like that, you'll say, oh, he's 100 years old, sexist. No, it's not. He's describing a very biologically rooted principle. That in the body itself, the identification with the body is more natural, more effortless, more easy, more complete, more rich in the female body than in the male. Now again, if you look at it from a very superficial point of view, as they do in the biological evolution, they'll say, yeah, men have to fight, so they cannot be too sensitive to injuries. They have to be impervious to injury. They should not feel pain so much. Yes, okay, maybe. But again, I say that is incidental. It's more the representation of the higher truth which makes for these. So yes, it does make a difference that in a battlefield, in crisis of life, you get a blow, the man feels less. woman feels more. Woman would therefore be much more vulnerable to the physical pain, but also at the same time, because of the ability to manage the pain and the left and right brain free flow, she is also resilient to greater quantity of pain. This is another interesting thing. A woman may feel more, both pleasure and pain, but also the resilience to intensity of pain is far greater in a female than a male, generally speaking. Of course, all of these, remember, are starting points. You can train yourself to develop exactly the qualities that you don't have. Go beyond whatever your starting point is. And that's going to be our goal in evolution, in our education. But in order to be able to do that, you must understand why there is this distinction, why some have an advantage in this over that. Observe this, but know that in terms of effort you can develop both. And I'll come to these examples later next time perhaps, because we're running out of time. When working with children, when I had to work with construction kits with boys and girls, boys got this very quickly, and with women I had to work differently. I think I've mentioned this as an example in the last two videos which were put up the last 2 weeks. But I found a way to tap into it, and I found the girls who made the effort. Initially there was a greater effort to make, and remember this is age 10, 11 children. The girls who made the effort, by the time they had crossed 2 or 3 months, they had actually developed the capacity almost equal to the boys in the ability of 3D visualization. Some more, some less, and the difference was those who made the effort. Some had perhaps a tendency even, they had a comfort, they enjoyed it when they succeeded, and so that grew. Others were resistant, they did not make the effort, they didn't get the joy of it, and they kind of half gave up. So they did develop to some degree, but those who enjoyed it and pursued got it to the same level as the boys. Now, this is to me extremely important, because later on when they go into higher mathematics or physics or some of these more technical subjects, the differences are so stark. And we have to understand why. Because the male mind, male brain, remember mind separate from emotion, allows for abstract thought more easily. In the female brain, the abstraction of thought is not so easy, but the sensory thought is easy. Remember, being plugged into the body. So if you give to the woman a practical question which requires a sensational application of logic, it will be very quick. The male may have a hard time. But if you give an abstract question, male will get it very quick, the woman will have a hard time, having not made the effort. Once they start making the effort, the woman can easily catch up and match that. Having matched it, she may still not enjoy it as much as he would at first. But if she chooses to and chooses to enjoy, then there's no end to what she can develop and compare or even beat the male. If she chooses to make that effort and pursue that line as an enjoyable line. And this is what we see in history. So understand there are hurdles initially. There's like a bump you have to cross. Once you've crossed it, it becomes easier, but you might have more than a couple of bumps to cross to get to the same. And the same from the male side to the female qualities. The things that men don't have naturally. If you start injecting estrogen, they may have those qualities beginning to kick in at the detriment of other qualities. But on the other hand, if they consciously develop those qualities, they will go through that hurdle, that bump, that difficulty. But having crossed the difficulty, they can develop will be as good, as rich, with certain limitations. And this is the interesting part. Remember the nerves endings of the body, skin surface? Are you going to grow as many nerve endings as a woman? Is that possible? So here's the radical answer I will give, and there is, I believe, enough research to point to it, except not enough research has been made to prove it in a more generic level. But my answer will be yes, but it depends what age. If during the growing years, the boys are made to focus on the sensations, on the sight, on the hearing, and focus on the richness and fine nuances of colors. For example, women see colors more richly than men, or at least the mind reduces in men the colors to a narrower range and a woman to more rich range, not reduced, let's say. But if the men are taught to observe, notice this difference. It looks the same, no, but observe. Observe, there's a fine difference. Pay attention, recognize this. Is it this? Is it that? Observe, observe, observe. Boring, but observe. And eventually you develop that faculty, and now I can distinguish between fuchsia and teal green and maybe 3 or 4 shades of greens which a male would not even bother remembering. But a woman would notice immediately, effortlessly. But the male, now having trained, can notice and recognize. In fact, a male farmer can be trained to recognize, they say, I don't know, up to 200 shades of green, and based on the shade recognize which plant is more healthy or less healthy, or what kind of illnesses might be creeping in. Training. But you have to make the effort. Having made the effort, you can easily develop all those faculties, and yet your container, remember, is still with the biology brain. Does that grow? I believe it does. Even if it does not, your consciousness is no more bound in the brain's limitation. It is free and can operate, use the brain's specialization without losing its freedom. So, coming back to the question, will there be more nerve endings? If you pay attention, if you take care, if you work on the body consciousness, make your body more conscious, yes, as your body grows, the nerve endings grow. After the age of 21, when the body is more or less fixed, this may not be so easy, but it will still be true. Now, this is my personal experience. Because of certain things which I had as an advantage, let's say, because of my teacher, because of certain things my mother had taught from childhood, I had a very highly developed body consciousness, and I was working on it consciously to intensify the sensitivity. And I could feel the growth. I could feel the growth of sensitivity of the nerves, and I could see that other boys of my age were losing their sensitivity. While I was not losing it, I was maintaining it as the body grew. To the detriment in certain areas, they had advantage in other areas. But I think in the long run, it's more useful to have a sensitive and richly developed body, even if you have higher sensitivity to sensation or pain. It's not a problem. That can be managed by strengthening and other ways. And the same with colors. Where I found I would pay attention, make that effort to push the boundaries, things were picked up quickly. And so I did that with various things. Now, if you go through an education which is reasonably rich, you are, let's say, painting, playing musical instruments, working in playing an instrument in an orchestral state where you have to align with other players of different instruments and listen to it all, some of this would happen automatically. You may not make an effort to push the boundary, but the work itself requires that boundary to be pushed. And so this can be used. What means you use to expand is not important. But essentially you would have to push the boundaries of your limitations, whether male or female, does not matter. Observe what are the things you have naturally strong, observe the ones which you have naturally weak, now push the boundaries. And with interest, with joy. If you can do it as a conscious effort, not merely as an incidental to learning an instrument or an activity, that has an advantage. So even as you play an instrument, you may make the effort to push the boundary, you can go much faster. Now all this I bring to the level of the more adult males, females. Okay, your body is now, let's say, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. And now you begin to become conscious and start pushing the boundary of consciousness. Will the nerves grow? Yes. Slower, because your body is now growing more slowly. The growth hormones are not so strong, etc. But it will grow. Not only the nerves here will grow, the nerves inside your brain will grow. The faculties which were lying dormant, trapped, bound because of hormonal balances, of biological bias, of gender, etc., all can be reactivated and reawakened. Maybe slightly slower. The same thing in a teenager would happen much faster. At the age of 20 would happen less fast. At the age of, in the 30s would happen less fast. 40s less fast. It will still happen. But if you have made your body conscious early on, then at any age, you can begin to push the boundary. So I have many more things to say about the gender and the relationship and the internal balance between these, which we will keep for next time. We will continue this topic to understand more precisely, but also for this application, which is for us as practitioners of the integral yoga. So I'm going to end with this example of Vishwanath Lahiri, who was the head of the engineering department in the ashram. He was very male, and I don't mean masculine, male. Okay, very limited, very restricted in certain things, very narrow in the typical untrained, undeveloped male type. So I don't expect higher refinement of those other faculties, but within his type, at the age of around 80, he said, and he had all these fantastic engineering books, amazing things, and he knew each book and their content. You could ask him something, he'll say, okay, here, and he'll go into his library, pull out one particular book, and he had read it, and he knew what was where. At the age of 80, he went up to 95 or something. At the age of 90 also, he could give you an appointment next week, we will meet on Thursday at 4:30 p.m. He won't have noted anywhere on a paper, he will remember on Thursday, 4:30 p.m. So, at the age of 80, he said, he felt as if he was beginning to lose his faculties, that they were beginning to degrade. And then he decided he didn't want to degrade. So, what did he do? He started learning computers. And learning computers at that point, this was in the 1990s, 91, 92, 93. They just had this little very crude PC desktops. And he starts learning with reading manuals. He can barely see his eyes, his thick glasses, and he's reading like this, so close, bright light. Late into the night, up to 11 at night, he's reading, studying, trying out. And then 2-3 weeks down, he starts programming computers in his 80s. And by that time, the person who was teaching him said, that's all I can do, I can't teach more. The rest, you'll have to figure your way out. And he self-taught the rest of his way as much as he wanted. And he overcame that tendency which he was beginning to feel of a decline. Simply by pushing the boundary of consciousness, well, the biology gets pushed. So yes, the nerve endings on your skin surface may take longer because it needs rebuilding a lot of that tissue, and that's slower at that age. But inside the head and the brain, and more than the brain, the consciousness boundaries, no limit, irrespective of age. But you must want to, you must enjoy, you must push the boundary and persist. So this is going to be our, let's say, closing point. We have been given by nature certain vessels, optimized, let's say, biased, specialized, to incarnate this aspect or that of the divine qualities of the masculine, feminine, etc. Our souls, which are all potential, infinite potential, choose a line of development especially. And this is important to understand. Sri Aurobindo says at first the soul may switch genders. Once it finds, yes, this is the line I want to develop, it tends to stay with that line, switching only when needed to specialize or to develop the other aspect and make a more complete vehicle. But broadly it tends to retain that line. And so having come to a certain stage in our evolution, we choose this vehicle and say, okay, this is how I'm going to experience this world, and this is the specialized line of development. But within that, I want to develop all the faculties. And nature is helping you by giving you a vehicle which is plastic enough, hopefully, that with this bias of a starting point, you will develop fully your potential. There's more which I want to discuss. What are the characteristics, particularly more distinctions between the male and the female, and now we're talking male-female, and not so much the psychological characteristics, but in what way it biases the characteristics, and in what way it distorts the nature of the ego distortions between the two and how it works. And you'll see some fascinating insights. You can think about it meanwhile. I'm sure you'll come to the same insights naturally. And then what happens when a male is alone or a female is alone? How do they work independently? How do they work jointly? What is the kind of complementarity that is possible? All of this is quite fascinating to understand and appreciate. And all of this will have massive implications in our growth and learning, as we are as adults or with children in their growth and learning. So I hope it will be a further stage of a very, I hope, fascinating and rich discussion. There are some questions already, and there are many more questions which have already come before. I'm holding them all. Please do leave the questions on. There's an interesting observation from Navja. Women have more rods and cones in their eyes. Yes, not only true in the sight. So the eyesight sees colors more richly, but also in the hearing, but also in the smell. Women can smell far more nuanced, but up to a ripe old age, whereas men tend to lose smell far more quickly. The same with taste, the same with touch. All the senses are stronger in women, more rich, more complete because of more nerve endings. And literally, that naturally tends to make you more identified with the body. And there are many women who will say, and I see this in the New Age material, they'll say, woman is body and we are embodied, we feel the body and etc. Which for men is a bit, what does that mean? I don't really know what you mean by that. It seems a little weird. I'd rather be identified with my mind. Yeah, because you don't feel the body with such richness and sensitivity. But you can. And for women equally, you can learn to identify with the mind free of body and be able to shift between the two. And then if you can do both, wow, that's a rich experience. For men, there's a disadvantage. You cannot amplify body sensations so easily because it means biological change. So there's certain advantages. We will see what happens when a man is alone or a woman is alone and wants to develop fully the qualities. There are certain very interesting differences and advantages. So we'll discuss all that next time. I hope this was fascinating and interesting discussion. If you have questions along these lines, do please send. I will perhaps next time have more time for the discussions. But for now, again, become conscious of this. Nature has given you a ready-made vehicle to help you in a certain line of development. Use the strengths that the vehicle gives you, but do not limit to its limitations. You are first and foremost divine consciousness with full infinite potential. And as you grow in consciousness, your vehicle also, you have to grow, expand and extend in its potential. To make yourself as complete as a conscious divine being, and as a divine being, a vehicle for everything the divine chooses to pour through you, and whatever poise or aspect that is needed to be poured through, not bound by anything. But for developing that which we do not have, we start with what we have and use that as the strength to develop what we do not have. So think about it, observe these things within yourself, observe these things in others, notice things. Many of these things we've discussed, perhaps you will begin to observe it and put into practice, push the boundaries of your capacities or incapacities. And it's a fascinating experience and a fascinating journey. So we'll pause here and take a moment to concentrate on this idea. That within us is the Purusha and the Prakriti. Their interplay within us is our growth and our evolution. Their awakening within us is our awakening. And so, in a sense, they are growing in us, in this vehicle. Divine Mother grows in us. The Divine Lord is growing in us. We are just the vehicles, the individual embodiments of their play.